Okay, this is where we left off last week, right? We were talking about the Phillips curve. Okay, just basically taking our ASAD model and looking at it from a slightly different angle. So in chapter 29, we're talking about the change in prices, inflation, and how inflation and output are potentially linked. And when we measure output, one of the important aspects of output is the fact that it is generated from employment, right? So if we're talking about output, another way of describing or discussing output is to talk about employment. So from our long run, short run aggregate demand, aggregate supply curve diagram, we saw that we can move away from a position of full employment, or in other words, a position of potential output. And when we do, this has impacts on the price. So if we then take that model into a slightly different context, we can plot employment or unemployment against change in prices or inflation. And we get the long run and short run Phillips curve. We had discussed this point B, and we had seen in diagrams, if our expectations of inflation are less than actual inflation, then our level of output increases. In other words, if Y0 is our full employment level of output, so that's the long run aggregate supply curve, okay? And we're initially at a point of equilibrium where our short run aggregate supply curve, our long run aggregate supply curve, and our aggregate demand curve all intersect. Moving forward, if there's some sort of expectation about what we think prices will do, how we expect prices to change, and we set our wages accordingly, that change in nominal wage demands shifts the aggregate supply curve. So if we expect the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right by some amount, leading to an expected increase in prices, we shift our aggregate supply curve, our short-run aggregate supply curve, to the left by some amount. In other words, we increase our wages by some amount that shifts aggregate demand to the left to match our increase in expected prices, right? If, of course, our inflation expectations are correct, then all that happens is when our aggregate demand shifts and our aggregate supply shifts, they increase by equal proportions so that our price level increases by the amount that was expected and we remain at full employment. If, however, our aggregate demand shifts further than what we expected, and our aggregate supply curve short run has shifted to the left by less than what was required to maintain full employment, we end up moving upwards along the short run aggregate supply curve. What happens? Prices increase by more than what we expected, and output increases. So in other words, when expected inflation is less than actual inflation, our level of output increases away from our full employment level. Okay? So when output increases by more, unemployment decreases. So we saw that a movement to point B is associated with higher than expected inflation as well as lower than full employment level of unemployment. So our unemployment decreases. That was a movement to point B. I then said, right, what about a movement to point C? Right? In other words, when expected inflation is greater than actual inflation, right? In other words, we expect aggregate demand to shift by some amount, so we adjust our wages, which shifts our aggregate supply to the left by some amount. Aggregate demand does not shift by as much as what we expected, so that inflation is lower than what we expected it to be. We expected inflation. We expected prices to increase to PE. They only increase to P1. What happens? Output decreases. In other words, unemployment increases. So a point like point C when inflation is lower than expected, unemployment is above the natural rate. Okay? So the question that we were left with at the end of last week was, if we have a short-run Phillips curve, SRPC 0, how or what is the mechanism that shifts a short-run Phillips curve to the left? Okay? So we saw, for example, if we were at a point like point B, our expectations adjust and our short-run Phillips curve shifts to the right. If we're at point C, then the expectation would be that given that point C is not at our long-run equilibrium position, the way we return to our long-run equilibrium position is for the short-run Phillips curve to shift to the left. Okay? I wanted you to show me in this diagram that we had previously constructed why or how our short-run Phillips curve shifts to the left. What is happening in our market that shifts it to the left? Did anyone spend any time outside of the lecture thinking about this? No? Not very surprising. So, returning to our initial example where we were at point B, we said what happens when we end up at this point away from our long-run equilibrium? In other words, our aggregate supply is shifted to the left. In other words, our nominal wages have increased, but they haven't increased by enough to take into account the actual increase in prices. So we're at this point over here. Let's just call it get rid of this, sorry. So we're going to call this little point here point B. Okay, so that corresponds to our point B here. Okay. How do we return from point B to the long-run equilibrium? Well, we have to adjust our nominal wages once again and shift our aggregate supply curve further to the left. In other words, we have to revise our expectations. So if our initial expectations were for PE, in other words, for prices to increase by some amount, returning to our initial diagram, we expected inflation. So here was our expected level. That's what our little square tells us, right? Our little note there. Expected inflation rate. So this was our expected inflation rates. We had some level of unemployment at point A that corresponded to the natural rate of unemployment given our expected inflation rate. Okay? Expected inflation rate. However, inflation was higher than what we expected. We ended up with prices increasing to P1 instead of PE. When inflation was higher than expected, output increased, unemployment decreased. Okay? So when the actual inflation rate at point B is somewhere between 10 and 15, so let's call it 12. So when inflation is actually at 12, so prices increased by 12% instead of 10%, our unemployment decreased. So when prices went up by more than we expected, we moved to point B. What shifts our curve back to the right? Well, when our aggregate supply curve shifts further to the left because we increase our nominal wage demands more, what we're saying is now we adjust our wages in terms of a higher expected inflation rate. We have now changed our expectations of inflation, right? We now expect inflation to be higher than what we originally expected. Instead of thinking that prices are only going to increase to PE, they're now actually going to increase to price level P2. So P2 is with our revised expectations. So revised expectations. Okay? So once we revise our expectations, okay, so maybe we now expect inflation to be at 15% instead of 10%. So at 15% is our expected inflation rate now. What happens when we've revised our expectation of inflation and it's correct? We end up back at full employment but with higher price levels, right? So if we're back at full employment, we're back at the natural rate of unemployment, but we now expect inflation to be much higher, right? Is everyone with me? We would be back at the long run level, but with a higher expectation of inflation. Given that we're now at a different starting point, this is our new equilibrium. Okay, so let's call this point here point D. Oops. Point D. Okay. Initially, our initial point of equilibrium, let's say, corresponds to point A. We move to point B. We're now back at long run equilibrium at point D. That would correspond to point D on our ASAD model. From point D, we can compare it to, say, point A. What would happen if once again we expected a certain rate of inflation, but inflation was in fact higher than what we expected? Are you happy that once again we would move to the right? We would increase employment. We would increase output. Is everyone with me or not? Some kind of feedback would be helpful? Yeah? So if we're starting at point D, a point of equilibrium, we expect inflation to be a certain level. Actual inflation is in fact higher than what we expected. We will lead to an increase in output. And from point D, we would lead to an decrease in unemployment, along with inflation being even higher than what we expected once again. So you can see that our short-run Phillips curve has shifted to the right. Okay? If we're at point C, then how do we end up getting back to long-run equilibrium from point C? The way that we do it is by our short-run Phillips curve shifting to the left or down. What happens? Okay? So here's our situation. We've got a short-run aggregate supply curve, an aggregate demand curve. We've got expectations which have shifted our aggregate supply curve. In fact, reality is that our aggregate demand has not increased by as much as what we expected. So we've ended up in a situation where actual inflation is less than expected inflation. Prices have increased by less than what we expected them to, okay? Which has led to a decrease in output. In other words, an increase in unemployment, as well as inflation expectations being less than expected. How does this situation rectify itself? Essentially, when we come to our next wage negotiations, we've had an increase in unemployment and inflation has been less than what we expected. So we revise our expectations of inflation downwards. Right? Everyone with me? So what happens then to our nominal wage demands? Well, they're going to decrease. If we don't expect prices to increase by as if we initially raised our wages by too much, we now need to lower our wage demands, right? What's that going to do to our aggregate supply curve? If we lower our wage demands, our aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. Yes, to the right, right? In other words, we're lowering our wage demands. Aggregate supply shifts to the right, to AS2. And we end up with inflation being even lower. Okay, so here once again we've got revised expectations, revised inflation expectations. Okay. Once we've revised our inflation expectations and we revise them correctly downwards, we lower our expectations of inflation. We return back to full employment. So when we lower our, so our initial expected, this was our initial level, this was our initial expectation of inflation. When we lower our expectation, because we were at point C, we lower our expectation, we return to our natural rate. So from point C, this is our initial point C, once we've lowered our inflation expectations, our entire short-run Phillips curve shifts to the left, returning us to the natural rate of unemployment, returning us to point, essentially, so this is our point D. Oops. Okay, this was our point C, and we had some initial point A. Okay, A, C, D, A, C, D, versus A, B, D, A, B, D. Okay? Great. So what shifts the short-run Phillips curve to the left? Why does it shift to the left? What is your understanding of the process? Decrease in wages, great. So we revise, so decrease nominal wage. Which shifts what? It shifts the short-run aggregate supply to the right. Okay. So we revise our expectations down. Decrease in nominal wage. Why? Let's do this. Why? Because we've let's do this. Lowered inflation expectations. Okay. Yes. Is that big enough? Sure. Okay, everyone happy? Anyone unhappy? No? It's 8:30 in the morning and everyone's happy. It's great. Okay, so that essentially concludes our discussion on the Phillips curve. So let me then introduce two Phillips curve questions for you. Okay, so the first one, I'll read it with you, and then you can answer it. Give you 2 minutes, and then we'll do the second one. So the first one, question 17. The short-run Phillips curve implies that output exceeds potential output when the price level is A, constant, B, increasing at an inflationary rate, C, less than the expected price level, D, greater than the expected price level, E, falling, and there is deflation. Okay? What do you think? What was that? No? That was just like a, I don't know, flutter fingers, yeah? Greater than the expected price level. Option D. Okay? What does everyone else think? You happy with option D? Okay? Any dissenting voices out there? No? Okay. Question 20. Trade-off between inflation and unemployment, and then there's 3 choices, is depicted by the long-run Phillips curve, is consistent with the theory of money neutrality, shows the possible effects of monetary policy in the short run. 1, 2, or 3, which ones do you think? Okay, how about option 1? Trade-off between inflation and unemployment, is that depicted by the long-run Phillips curve? Does the long-run Phillips curve show any trade-off between unemployment and inflation? No, it does not. When we change the inflation rate, does it have any effect on unemployment in the long run? No, that is what the long-run Phillips curve shows us. It's a vertical curve. In other words, it's telling us there's no relationship between inflation and unemployment in the long run. So there's no trade-off. Number 2. Is it consistent with the theory of money neutrality? The short run, in other words, the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Is that consistent with the theory of money neutrality? Do we need a refresher on money neutrality? What does that mean? Anyone remember what that means? Money neutrality? No? Anyone want to take a guess? I don't know what they remember? No? Okay. So money neutrality means that when you change the money supply, it has no real effect. The only thing that a change in money supply does is change price levels. Do you remember the quantity theory of money? MV equals PY? Right? What did that equation, what was the theory behind the equation? That we had MV equals PY. And the idea, or the theory behind this was that, in fact, if you increase M, what happens is we just end up with an increase in P with no change in Y. Okay? Money is neutral. So if we increase money supply, it leads to an increase in prices. In other words, it leads to inflation. But it doesn't change output, so there's no change in unemployment. Is there a trade-off between inflation and unemployment in terms of the theory of money neutrality? No, there is no trade-off. Okay? What about option 3? Shows the possible effects of monetary policy in the short run. Did I hear someone muttering yes over there? Yeah? Okay. So option number 3, is that a potential contender? Are you happy that that is indeed what it shows? If we change the money supply, right? I mean, we have any kind of monetary policy intervention, we shift aggregate demand. If it's unexpected, it leads to an increase in output, an increase in prices, a movement along a short-run aggregate supply curve. A movement along a short-run aggregate supply curve is synonymous with a movement along a short-run Phillips curve. And a short-run Phillips curve is a demonstration or an illustration of the trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Any questions there? Anything that you want me to clarify? Anything you are unhappy with? Speak now, or hold your peace until next year. No? Okay. Cool. So then the option would be, or the answer would be B. Yeah? Great. Okay. So then we move back to the business cycle. So we started with the business cycle in chapter 21. We spoke about the business cycle when we did our ASAD model, and once again, talking about the business cycle. So we're still trying to understand why we have this thing. So understanding why. Why is there a business cycle? So the way that your textbook presents it, it discusses, I guess, two kind of main theories behind this. The one would be, well, the way that they've categorized it is to say, first of all, there's the sort of mainstream business cycle theory. In other words, the kind of business cycle theory that is generally accepted now, which is kind of an extension of number two was the real business cycle theory, so RBC theory. So the RBC was kind of the precursor to what I guess you would now call the mainstream. So the mainstream is just taking the RBC and extending it a little bit. So how do we explain the business cycle then in terms of this kind of current thinking? The idea is that over time, potential GDP grows. And it tends to grow relatively regularly. In other words, there is a kind of a consistent growth rate that an economy will experience. So the economy just always tends to grow at whatever, 3% or 4%, or if you're China, 10%, right? If you're South Africa, yeah, not very much, right? Okay, so your GDP is just generally growing at a fairly steady state. In contrast, aggregate demand tends to grow, yes, but it sometimes grows fast and it sometimes grows less fast, sometimes it even shrinks. Okay? So aggregate demand tends to fluctuate. Okay? In other words, we're saying that the supply side potential GDP, that's a fairly steady growth rate, it's kind of stable, and then you have this aggregate demand side which is a little bit unstable. Okay? So over time, our long-run aggregate supply curve is increasing, okay? And at the same time, our aggregate demand curve, right, is shifting to the right. In other words, it's growing. Now the question is, how does aggregate demand grow relative to how aggregate supply grows? Okay? We've already described the fact that in reality, we know that the money wage rate, for example, tends to be fairly sticky. And there's numerous reasons for why it's kind of sticky. You know, wage contracts and negotiations and things influence that kind of, that stickiness. So if then the aggregate demand grows faster than potential GDP, okay? In other words, the long run aggregate supply curve is shifting to the right, but aggregate demand shifts even faster, okay? And people don't expect it. So in other words, the wages are negotiated in a way that doesn't anticipate that. Then what we have is our long-run aggregate supply curve grows, right? And along with the shift in the long-run aggregate supply curve comes a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve as people adjust their wages in anticipation of inflation. But if aggregate demand grows faster, right, so that we end up at like a point D, what do we end up with? Well, we have an inflationary gap. We are above potential, and inflation is higher than we expected. Okay? Does that sync with everything we've spoken about so far? That same story, right? The alternative is that if aggregate demand grows slower than our potential, then what's going to happen? Well, then we end up at a point like point C. And real GDP moves below potential and we end up with a recessionary gap. So that's point C and that's point D. If aggregate demand decreases, well then obviously we're also going to be in a recession. So the question then is, in terms of the mainstream business cycle theory, is why is aggregate demand relatively unstable? Why does it sometimes increase a lot and sometimes it doesn't increase a lot and sometimes it goes backwards? What's the story here? So within the mainstream business cycle theory, in terms of your textbook, it kind of distinguishes between four reasons for why the aggregate demand curve is a little bit more unstable. In other words, why it doesn't just adjust, why it isn't easy to anticipate. In other words, why we get our expectations of its shifting incorrect. So each of these is basically reflective of the different theories that you saw in the previous chapter. So at the end of chapter 28, there were three primary theories that were discussed, macroeconomic theories. There was the classical viewpoint, there was the Keynesian viewpoint, and there was the monetarist viewpoint, if you recall. Right? The Keynesian classical viewpoint was basically saying that the economy, what's important in the economy is the supply side. Okay? In other words, it's fluctuations in supply that are important to the economy. The Keynesian theory said, supply changes, but what's more important, in fact, is demand. The way that demand fluctuates is more important. Okay? And then the monetarist theory said, yes, it is the demand side, like what the Keynes say, but the reason that the demand side is important is because it has to do with how money is controlled in the economy. We've seen that when we adjust the money supply, that affects aggregate demand, right? So the monetarists said the reason that there's fluctuations in aggregate demand, or the way that it changes, or what's important about it, is it's linked to the money supply and control of money in the economy. Okay? So the monetarists and the Keynesians are sort of demand side, and the classicals were more supply side. Okay? In the mainstream business cycle, we've kind of brought all of that together. So we're saying, yes, there's shifts in supply, and yes, there's shifts in demand. So everyone accepts that there's shifts in both of them. The question is then, I guess, which is kind of more important? Is it demand side or supply side? Right? So the Keynesian description of why aggregate demand fluctuates and is relatively unstable is because there's this thing called what Keynes referred to as animal spirits. Okay? In other words, part of aggregate demand is investment spending. And investment spending, right, is driven by business confidence. Why do businesses invest? Because they have some sort of expectation of what they think is going to happen in the future. The more confident they are of the future, the more likely they are to invest. The less confident they are of the future, the less likely they are to invest. So one of the big things in the South African political discourse at the moment is the fact that there's a lot of political uncertainty. What does political uncertainty generate? Uncertainty in the economy generally. When you have uncertainty in the economy generally, what does that mean for firms who want to make business decisions? They're a little bit less. If they're not certain about what they think is going to happen in the future, do you want to go and spend 20 million rand building a factory? Oh yeah, I'm not sure. If I spend 20 million rand building a factory, and then the state comes in and says, no, we're doing land redistribution, right? We're going to take without compensation. Okay? If you've already built a 20 million rand factory, well, there's not much you can do about it. But if you're now deciding whether you should build a 20 million rand factory, if you think the state might come along and say, right, we're going to expropriate that and give you nothing in return, are you likely then to want to build a 20 million rand factory, right? So even though the state has not come out and said, we are going to expropriate, right, without compensation, the fact that there's even uncertainty about whether that could happen affects decisions today, right? So business confidence affects investment spending. And Keynes referred to that business confidence as animal spirits. In other words, sometimes everyone's super happy, like we are this morning, and sometimes everyone's just super depressed, right? And they don't want to do it. So that was the Keynesian reason for why aggregate demand changes in a way that's relatively unpredictable. Okay? The monetarists, sticking to monetarist theory, say obviously, in fact, it's not just investment, it's also consumption. And in fact, it's any spending that is influenced by the availability of money. So in other words, any irregularities in monetary policy, when you can't anticipate correctly what the Reserve Bank is going to do, that leads to irregular or unanticipated or unexpected or unstable aggregate demand spending, right? So what does the Reserve Bank do? The Reserve Bank focuses on inflation, and before it even makes any decision about whether to raise interest rates or leave them unchanged or do any other kind of policy intervention, is it has a meeting. Okay, it has the Monetary Policy Committee meeting, and then they have a media briefing, and they say, this is what we have seen in the economy at the moment. This is what we expect to see in the economy, right? This is what we are doing today, given what we see, and if what we expect to see does happen, this is what we will do. So that between now and the next meeting, you can look at what the numbers are, you can see what the economy is doing, and you can say, right, the economy is doing what the Reserve Bank said they thought it would do, therefore we can expect the Reserve Bank to do what they said they would do, right? Which then leads to predictability in monetary policy. And as long as you have predictable monetary policy, the monetarists say, as long as your monetary policy is relatively predictable, you won't have wild fluctuations in aggregate demand. What leads to wild fluctuations in aggregate demand? When there's unanticipated changes to monetary policy stuff. Okay? And both of these are kind of a reflection of what they describe here as new classical theory versus new Keynesian cycle theory. New classical cycle theory is in fact more like the real business cycle theory is the new classical cycle theory is where it begins. Then the real business cycle theory, because it's classical, focuses on the supply side. And when the classical guys talk about demand side from a new classical perspective, their interest is in saying, right, when consumers make decisions, the decisions that they make are rational. They make expectations based on what they see, and what they see they evaluate correctly, so that they don't make wild, ridiculous decisions. Everything they can see the information and they can predict accurately. And according to those predictions, they make rational decisions. Okay? So the only thing that leads to an unexpected change in aggregate demand, right? So remember, we've got rational expectations, is when you have unexpected changes in aggregate demand. In other words, if there's an expected change in aggregate demand, when you've got an expected change, people adjust their actions rationally. Okay? So what would that look like as an aggregate supply curve, aggregate demand curve? What it's saying is, if everyone expects that the aggregate demand curve will shift to AD1, right? And they know that potential output is increasing from LS0 to LS1, they will naturally and rationally adjust their expectations of inflation to shift the aggregate supply curve in the short run to AS1, so that we will remain at long run equilibrium. Okay? That would be the rational expectation. So how do we move to point C or point D? The way that we do that is only if there is some kind of unexpected change in aggregate demand. Okay? And we know that the kind of unexpected change could be then, the monetarists might say, well, it might be a monetary policy thing. The Keynesians might say, oh, it has something to do with investment spending, right? The classical guys would emphasize also, you can have an unexpected change in, say, taxes. Government changes tax rates unexpectedly. Or the government decides to increase spending and it was unexpected, right? Then we can have a movement to point C or point D. But the new classical theory would say, even if we move to point C or point D, it will be only for a very brief period of time, because as soon as people realize this has happened, they immediately adjust their expectations, and correctly we move back to long run. Okay? So really, for the classical side of things, when we're looking at aggregate demand, the only thing that moves us away from this long run level is when something unexpected happens. That's the classical theory. The new Keynesian theory would say, yeah, we might have rational expectations, that's fine, but in fact, remember, we've spoken about this idea that wages and prices generally are sticky. Okay? So, what makes them sticky? Well, not only do our expectations, right, matter for the future, but they also matter for today. Okay? And we make an expectation for today, and once we've made that expectation, we may be correct in that expectation, or we may be incorrect in that expectation, right? So, in other words, the classical theory says basically what we can expect something, and in fact we will be correct in that expectation unless something unexpected happens, okay? Whereas the Keynesian side of things would say, oh, we expect something, but we might also be wrong in that expectation, as well as the fact that there might be completely unexpected things that we didn't even anticipate anyway, right? You can see all of them are kind of very similar, right? It's just slight change in emphasis about why we end up at C or D, okay? And that's why it's fairly mainstream. You know, everyone can get behind this at some point, right? Whether you think it's more about business expectations, whether you think it's more a policy-driven thing, right? Whether you think it's more supply side or whether you think it's more demand side. You still think that they both can have an effect, okay? And all of this arises out of the real business cycle theory, which really said that the thing that mattered the most was not even aggregate demand. In other words, all of this aggregate demand side stuff, the real business cycle theory has very little to say about that. Aggregate demand is not that important. What's important is aggregate supply. And we can talk about that when we come back. So take a quick 10-minute break. Then we'll finish this discussion quickly on the real business cycle, the real business cycle theory, and then we will begin with our chapter 30, which is our fiscal policy stuff.